Being a pastor is a little bit like going through a compressed version of life every few weeks. In any given week, I might be getting ready to conduct a funeral or sitting by the bedside of a person who is in great pain, or I may be performing a baptism and preparing a family for their baptism of their first child, or I might be preparing a couple to get married. There are so many different phases of life that I am confronted with every single week of ministry. It's like going through life every 2 or 3 weeks, except in a very compressed way. When I get up in the morning, Dan asks me on most mornings, "What's your day look like?" Dan knows what his day looks like. He knows what his day looks like even before the day begins. But I don't always know. After one of a particularly long day that went on from 7 in the morning till late 10 o'clock at night, I got up the next morning kind of weary around 9 a.m., lounging about in the house, thinking that I had an empty calendar that day and some time to rest, and then I got a call. A parishioner had died the night before. So, from that moment on, for the next 3 days, my ministry life was altered and my calendar was changed. I'm going to be talking about life in ministry, but also life in general today as a sacred journey. Because one of the things that I've learned from being exposed to this super-saturated version of life that I get as a pastor is that each moment is sacred. I am literally soaked in sacred moments every day. This is one of the wonders of being a pastor. But from that, I've learned that every single moment that we live is sacred, and it is to be treasured. Well, the disciples encountered a sacred moment. That day, they went up on the mountain, which you saw demonstrated here. And I will read you again that story so you can listen to the details one more time, because it is one of the most important stories in the Gospels. And it takes place in Matthew 17. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell on the ground and were overcome with fear. But Jesus came and touched them, and he said, "Get up. Do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one there with them except Jesus. For the first 15 chapters of Matthew, there is a sort of rhythm to the disciples' experience as they journeyed with Jesus. Yes, each day brought surprises and wonderful experiences of healing and teaching, but there was sort of a rhythm to it. The morning of prayer, the day of journeying, the evening of prayer, and the miracles and the teachings that happened in between. All of that changed when Matthew 16 arrives in our Bibles. It happened because one day Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you think that I am?" Now, most of the disciples had never even entertained the notion that Jesus might be the Messiah. And so they gave a lot of other kinds of answers to that question. A prophet, perhaps Elijah, perhaps Moses come back from the dead, many answers. But then Peter, as he was wont to do, perked up and said, "You are Messiah." And he had the right answer. So he got a blessing. Jesus said to Peter, "Blessed are you." But then, as soon as Peter identified Jesus as Messiah, Jesus started talking about the fact that he had to suffer and he had to die. And all of that was something that Peter did not want to hear ever, ever. And so he perked up once more and he said, "Forbid it, Lord." And Jesus then turned to Peter and issued to him the sharpest rebuke we find in the Gospels. "Get behind me, Satan." Wow. The whole apple cart was turned over at that very moment. All the things that they thought were true were rolling around on the ground like apples falling out of a cart. What in the world is going on now? They were probably wondering to themselves, which is something that I wonder to myself on a day of ministry, say, where I am given the privilege to baptize an infant. This is one of my most special days in ministry, to hold a baby in my arms and to say the words of baptism. And then I go home and I'm full of joy and love and I'm glowing. And then at 2:00 in the afternoon, I get a call. And it's not a good call. It's a call of someone near death or someone suffering greatly. And I want to say, "Forbid it, Lord." I want to hold on to these good feelings. I just don't want to go to the place of suffering today. Can't I just have one day that's just joy? And then you can save that part for tomorrow? But no. That's not the way ministry is. And as you may have noticed, that isn't the way life is either. Great joy can be followed with great suffering, almost so quickly that it can spin your head around. And that is what happened to the disciples. 6 days after that happened, then Jesus took them up to the mountain, and he was transfigured in their sight. He was so bright that they couldn't recognize who he was. He was almost like pure light. And they were terrified, so they fell on their faces. But before they fell all the way down, they noticed that Moses and Elijah were standing there with Jesus. And then after they were prostrate on the ground, they heard God speaking out of heaven, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." They're still face down in the dirt, terrified. Have you ever been immobilized by something? I mean, something that just really stopped you in your tracks? Maybe it's been a close call on the road. I've had that happen where I feel like I almost have to pull over because I got so frightened by something that just almost happened but didn't. Or maybe if you're a parent, you've had that experience when you've watched your child rush into a dangerous situation and you only have moments to save them, to bring them back. When those kinds of things happen in our lives, it fractures time. Time becomes frame by frame. Everything slows down, and it's like you're watching a super slow 33 1/3 movie, and you're immobilized. That's where the disciples were when they were lying face down on the ground. But did you notice what happened after that? Jesus came up to them, and he put his hand on their shoulder. He stooped down, and he said to them, "Arise. Do not be afraid. Let us be going." That is what our sacred journey of life is like. We may be going along, doing fairly well, as far as we can tell, surrounded by our loved ones, feeling healthy, enjoying our life, and then all of a sudden, some event comes and slices our world in two, and then we're face down on the ground, or we're in a hospital sitting next to our loved one who has gotten some news that isn't good, and we feel the touch on our shoulder, and we hear something we think we've heard before. Do not be afraid. Get up. And then, as we're experiencing that, our loved one reaches out to us and says, it'll be all right. Holy moment. That is a holy moment. That is what our sacred journey looks like. We suffer, and then we have these holy moments, and we rise, and we go on, and we encounter more things, and then we suffer, and we have holy moments, and we have stretches of wonderful life without problems again and again and again. That is what the sacred journey looks like. And Jesus was trying to explain that to his disciples, but they didn't have enough experience yet. They hadn't seen the transfiguration. They hadn't seen the crucifixion. And you know, those two events are like shadows of one another. They're like the reverse side of one. When Jesus was transfigured, he went up on a mountain. When he was crucified, he was taken up a hill. When he was transfigured, he was flanked on both sides by the heroes of the faith, Moses and Elijah. When he went up on the hill, he was surrounded by two thieves. When he went up on the mountain, his clothes were so bright they shone like light itself. When he went up on the hill, he was stripped of his clothing. When he went up on the mountain, the voice of God said, "This is my son." When he went up on the hill, a soldier at the feet of the cross watched him and said, "Surely this man was God's son." Each another side of the other. Death, resurrection, suffering, compassion. Each experience having a reverse side to it. For if we did not have both sides, the joy and the sorrow, the death and the resurrection, we would not understand our life at all. But we do have both sides, and they are a whole within us. And knowing that both sides of our lives will occur at various times helps us to grasp each moment as a sacred moment. All of our moments may not be good, but they can all be holy. Making mistakes leads us somewhere we would have never journeyed before. Experiencing suffering makes room for more compassion. Death even teaches its lessons. I can't tell you how many times I have stood with the person who was dying and the one who loved them, and have that person who loved them turn to me and say, "If I never believed before now, I do believe now." I do not know what turn in your journey you are experiencing right now, but I invite you to take each moment and treasure it and sanctify it, because it is holy. And it is a moment that you and God are creating together that will never happen again. It is a treasure. It belongs to you. And it is your moment and your journey. And as you are able to do that, even if you're experiencing suffering, you might have that experience too that the disciples had after they saw Jesus transfigured before them. That experience of being touched on our shoulder, of hearing the voice that is so clear and comforting to us, saying, "Arise, don't be afraid. Let us be going."